get started. My name is Beth Daniels, and I'm an assistant professor here at UCCS in the psychology department. And I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Cheryl Cooky as our speaker for the evening. And Dr. Cooky is an associate professor of American Studies at Purdue University, and she received her PhD in sociology and gender studies from the University of Southern California. Her scholarship is interdisciplinary, and it's situated at the intersections of sociology, kinesiology, media studies, and women's and gender studies. Her research centers on the way gender shapes experience, cultural meaning, and social structures in sports. Dr. Cooky is past president of the North American Society for the Sociology of Sport, and she is a leading feminist sports scholar. She is also deeply committed to public sociology and has a widely viewed TED Talk that you all should look up. She regularly speaks about issues of gender inequality in the world sport media, including she's appeared on PBS NewsHour, NPR, and many local, national, and international media outlets. So please help me welcome Dr. Cooky to UCCS, and we're very happy to have her here.
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Daniels, and thank you to the Daniels Fund. I'm by no relation, I'm assuming, to the Daniels Fund for hosting this event and for having me here today. And thank you all for being with me here physically in this space. And then for those of you out streaming live, hi. Hopefully my husband is one of them, but probably not. Not because he doesn't care, but because he works hard. Okay, so the title of my presentation today, I should also thank Dr. Jeff Montez de Oca and Dr. Daniels again for taking time out of their schedules to show me around and host me. Dr. Montez de Oca, aka Jeff, Big Jeff, as we like to call him in the NAS world. We're both contemporaries, went to graduate school together, and my first memory of Jeff, although it might not be the first time we met, we took a class on media, I believe the sociology of media, with Dr. Barry Glassner. And I just remember Jeff being this sort of theoretically conceptual powerhouse, and I was so appreciative of having a fellow graduate student who would actually push me intellectually. And so it's just really a pleasure to be here today and to get to visit and spend time with him. So, okay, I think I've said all my thank yous, hopefully. I want to apologize, too. I have not acclimated to the altitude, and so I'm finding myself kind of getting a little out of breath as well as forgetting words, and I'm going to blame that on the altitude. So I apologize if I maybe stop and catch a breath. Okay, so title of my talk is Gender in Sport Media, Ethical Challenges and Considerations. And so what I'd like to do today with you all is to talk a little bit about some of my research, which focuses on the media, and particularly a study that I've been involved with since I was a graduate student. So about 20, 30 plus years of research has shown that the vast majority including local coverage, the Olympics, and niche outlets. And what we've seen from this body of scholarship are patterns that sort of translate across geographical boundaries and media platforms. And so for me, I think this is an important setup for this talk because I want to think about why this might be the case, why we see change in some areas, in some spaces, and in some ways a stagnation, a retraction, a resistance to that change in others. So the study that I would like to talk to you about today is a longitudinal research that I've been involved in, as I mentioned, as a graduate student. This is a project that was started back in the late 1980s with my then dissertation advisor, who's also Jeff's dissertation advisor, former, and who's now my colleague. And if you know anything about the world of gender in sport, you know the name Michael Messner. And so he and his contemporary at the time colleague, Margaret Carlisle Duncan, initiated this study. I took over in various aspects as sort of personnel transition, and was involved with the study as a graduate student, kind of doing the grunt work. So I've seen both sides, and can share with you the sort of tediousness that goes into coding data, and some of the students in the audience or at home might know how onerous this can be. In terms of the background, as I mentioned, this is a longitudinal study. Data is collected every 5 years. So again, I wasn't collecting data back in 1989, but came into the study in 1999. And it's a snapshot of every 5 years, and I'll get a little bit more into me about this particular study is that it is intended as public advocacy social science research. And I can talk a little bit about some of the background as to how this study came about, but this was really initiated with the intent to disseminate empirical-based evidence to media outlets to demonstrate the ways in which their coverage was maybe a little less desirable than we would hope it would be, that there was some problematic aspects in the way that they were covering men's and women's sports. And so as a part of that, the goal is to distribute the results of this project in a number of different venues to a number of different populations. It goes out to the mass media, and in fact, this latest iteration of the study had quite a bit of traction. It's been featured in documentary films used by organizations like the Women's Sport Foundation in terms of their advocacy efforts, as well as taught in some schools of journalism. And this is not to say like, oh, look how important we are, and this is such great research, but I think for me, given my ethics and the reason why I got into academia in the first place, which was to use knowledge production for social change, this is really important to me to be involved in a study that's not just read by the 4 or 5 scholars in my field who know postmodern, post-structuralist theory and can talk about Foucault or Deleuze or whoever. I don't know what those names actually mean, but Jeff says them in conversations with me, so I just picked them up from him. But that it's actually demonstrating a potential impact, or at least I hope it does. So our central aim in this particular study was to examine change in continuity over time, and so I'm going to share with you the results from the latest iteration of the study, which was published in 2014, but I'll also talk about some of the historical trends that we've seen across the various data points as well. So in terms of the study itself, we're looking at the ways in which televised sports news media cover men's and women's sports and how that might differ, and again, what are those changes and continuities? For the kind of method geeks in the audience, which I'm sure most of you are, this gives you kind of an overview of what we did. So we look at the 6 p.m. and 11 p.m. broadcasts on the local news affiliates in Los Angeles across 2-week blocks in March, July, and November. And we do that strategically to kind of get at different sports that might be happening, different sporting events that might be happening across the year. We also, at one point in the study, added an ESPN Sports Center when that became a big sport media outlet. And we look at 1 week of the 11 p.m. broadcasts in March, July, and November. And so this involves a content analysis looking at a number of different variables, including the gender, the type of sport, production values, and so on. So in this next slide, what we see is one of the major findings of the study, which is a deepening silence. And if you can't read those numbers here, I'll walk you through them. So what this graph is depicting is on the x-axis are the year points. So it starts at 1989 and goes through 2014. And then the percentage of coverage. The red section of the bars represent women's coverage. The blue section represents men's coverage, and then the green section at the top is what we call gender neutral or both. So these were events where either the gender of the sport isn't prevalent, or where both men and women are competing at the same time. So if there's a fitness activity that's getting covered in the news, for example, or the Los Angeles Marathon gets kind of coded as both. What we see in this graph if you can see it. What are we seeing? It's gotten worse. Okay, so it's gotten worse. Come on in. Hi. We're just talking about gender in media. So it's gotten worse over time. I'm assuming the women's media coverage you were referring to. So I tell my students when I talk about this study, like if aliens came down to Earth and we gave them Sports Center as a way to understand, or we gave them the local news, or we gave them other media outlets as a way to understand sport, they wouldn't know in most instances that women are playing sports. The amount of coverage of sports has actually declined over the course of our study. It's now at 3.2%, whereas it was at 5%. This may not be a statistically significant decline, but it's definitely a decline in either way. If you're going from 1.6 to 3.2, I mean, it's the general point here is that it's pretty abysmal. We did see a spike in 1999. A lot of people think, oh, well, that must be the Women's World Cup when the team won. Mia Hamm and Brandi Chastain, those of you that are old enough to remember and have watched that event, this bump, and I'll talk about this later in the presentation, numbers don't always mean what we think they mean. So it's like, oh, 8.7%, that's great. It actually is, that's pretty good. But the majority of that was stories that focused on the Women's World Cup team and Brandi Chastain's striptease. And the Ponytail Express, there were very lengthy segments that featured a naked bungee jumper, very long segments that featured Sable, who's a professional wrestler who had appeared in Playboy and so on. So we really need to be careful and cautious when we're thinking about quantity as a measure. We also have to look at quality. So broken down another way, this is just illustrating the differences between the local network news, which is depicted in blue, and ESPN SportsCenter. And SportsCenter across the board hasn't gone anywhere near the 3% mark. It's hovered around 1% to 2% over the course of the study. Now, what's remarkable about this as well is that you would think, or potentially hypothesize, that over the course of 25 years, or in the case of ESPN SportsCenter, the course of 15 years, that we would see more coverage of women's sports in televised news and highlight shows, just for the fact that there are more professional leagues, there's more women playing sports at the collegiate level, there's more excitement and interest, there are more women sport fans. Yes, I said that right. Fans of women's sports than there were in the past. So we might expect to see something different, but we don't. We can think about why that is. This breaks it down in terms of segments or stories. I just want to highlight here that there were 88 different independent, or I should say unique stories about men's sports on the local affiliates, while there were only 32. And on SportsCenter, 376 stories on men's sports and only 13 on women's. And so what we found in our study is that it's never too soon, too early, or too late to talk about men's sports. And this is actually direct quotes from the commentators that we pulled from this. The vast majority of the coverage of sports, not only is it men's sports, but it's the men's big three. So professional and collegiate football, basketball, and baseball dominated the coverage in the 2014 data set. And this is very similar to other findings. The women's sport that garnered the most coverage was women's basketball, and I think it comes in at about 2.3% of the total coverage. What we also did is we broke this down and looked at different sports that were somewhat comparable, the NBA and the WNBA. And what we find is that there's more coverage of men's sports when they're out of season than there is coverage of women's sports when they're in season. So men's sports gets talked about regardless of whether or not the competitive season is going on. The news media finds all kinds of ways to bring in stories about men's sports even when there aren't competitive events taking place. For example, one of the local affiliates ran a 22-second segment. Now, 22 seconds is a long time in local news, and a sports segment on the local news might just be 2 to 3 minutes, 4 minutes long. So 22 seconds is a big chunk. And this is on a day when there's no stories on women's sports, despite the fact that the NCAA women's tournament was taking place, as well as a number of other women's sporting events. So the local affiliate found 22 seconds of its coverage to talk about, I believe it was an 18-inch hot dog, corn dog, that was for sale at the Arizona Diamondbacks Stadium for $25 that fans could purchase. Another day during the month of March, local affiliate also spent about 55 seconds of their 2 to 3 minutes of coverage talking about Hank. I'm a dog owner. I love dogs. So this is, love to see stories about puppies. This was a stray dog that had wandered into the Milwaukee Brewers Stadium. And they had this sort of fan call in to figure out what we were going to name this dog. And they named him Hank. And the story is all about Hank and whether or not he was going to get adopted. So, hot dogs, yes. Women's collegiate basketball at its peak, maybe not. What's the data? What's the numbers on that? So we compared the coverage, and unfortunately the dates, the way that they fall, we don't actually get to capture the Final Four tournament, so the last 4 games of the tournament. We kept the dates of the study consistent because it's a longitudinal study, so we could compare over time. But what I will say is that other researchers have looked at the coverage of men's and women's sports during the Final Four, the actual Final Four games, and they find very similar trends in terms of the lack of coverage of the women's games. So local affiliates spend nearly an hour and a half of our total sample talking about the men's game, 120 individual stories, while spending only 3 minutes or 9 stories on women's basketball. Now what's interesting, what people will say is like, well, they want to cover the local teams, it's local news. There was a long segment about a team in, I believe it was Pennsylvania. The coach's grandson wore a suit to a game and walked along the court and imitated his grandpa's coaching gestures during the game. And there was a minute-long segment about that. Again, Los Angeles, Pennsylvania, USC is playing, no coverage. ESPN Sports Center, even more egregious. And what's interesting to me, and what I think gets at the kind of supply and demand, or at least challenges that sort of supply and demand conventional wisdom by which a lot of sports media and journalism people operate by, is well, we just cover what people want to see. We are just giving we're giving viewers what they want. This is about money. This is about economics. Whatever kind of rationales that get employed. What's interesting to me, though, and what I still haven't been able to figure out, and if someone can explain it to me, please email me. I'm online, Twitter at Prof. Cooky. In the Q&A we can talk about this. Can someone please explain to me how ESPN, who broadcasts the NCAA women's tournament on ESPN2, their sister station, does not do more to promote the women's tournament during SportsCenter, which is their premier highlight show. ESPN as a network is one of the largest cable networks. SportsCenter is one of the kind of premier places to go to find sports. I'm not quite sure how we explain or understand this phenomenon if the only lens by which we are looking at it is a kind of business economic model. And my husband, I will say, this isn't to disparage those in the business world, because my husband is in the business world, and so some of my good friends are business people and husband. Jeff got my joke, okay? Sorry. One of the other things that we found too is it's not just in the amount of coverage or what stories get covered, but it's how they get covered. And one of the things that we noticed in the 2014 study, particularly because some of the sexualization and trivialization that we had observed in previous iterations had sort of dropped down, which is the style in which men's sports was presented in comparison to the style in which women's sports was presented. So there's this kind of amplified delivery. Men's sports events are described as a thriller, a battle. Whoa, he threw down that dunk. Oh, he ripped a double. Male athletes are described as going full throttle, and their performances are sensational, picture perfect, incredible. Male athletes are a rock star and it's spectacular. Whereas women's sports was typically presented in a very monotone, matter-of-fact style. Congratulations to the women of Troy, who learned tonight they are a 9th seed in women's basketball tournament. They'll play St. John's in the first round. So what we argue, and we talk about this in an upcoming paper that will hopefully be published soon, is that the commentary on men engages the audience and is an active audience building. It creates excitement and interest in men's sports. The exciting tone with steady flow of superlatives conveys to viewers that this is exciting. Men's sports are what we want to watch. We want to relive the excitement of having seen the game through the highlight shows. Whereas the commentary on women, we describe it as gender bland sexism. And this is a term that I believe Michael Amusto came up with, a graduate student who was integral in terms of analyzing this data. And gender bland sexism draws upon Eduardo Silvia. Okay, his concept of colorblind racism. Colorblind racism is this kind of prevailing ideological framework that's prominent today by which we understand, according to Benia Silva, thank you, that we understand sexism through the lens of kind of individualism, any types of discrimination, structural barriers, interpersonal dynamics that occur are no longer because of overt racism, but it's the lack of individual effort, the lack of work ethic, something that sort of resides within the individual. Scholars have taken off this concept and talked about gender blind sexism, and this is very similar in terms of the ways in which sexism in our culture, because it's no longer culturally appropriate or accepted, has sort of gone underground. So the more overt instances of sexism that we saw, up until the 1970s, 1980s, are less overt and they're covert, right? So gender blind sexism, again, is this idea that sexism operates again, not based on any sort of structural or institutional basis, but more based on the kind of individual and their lack. So gender bland sexism then is a sort of takeoff of that, where we're talking about gender isn't really blind in sport because it's salient. Sports are sex segregated. So it's a sort of way of talking about how within the commentary itself, sexism is more covertly operates on a level that's not really conscious to us. So in other words, there's been these kinds of important shifts. So commentators are no longer overtly engaging in humorous sexualization and trivialization of women in women's sports as they had done in past iterations of the story, like I mentioned with the naked bungee jumper and Brandi Chastain's striptease and so on. And they're no longer engaging in situating and framing athletes to the same extent as wives and mothers and girlfriends. So we went through these kind of very conventional gender roles and norms and expectations in terms of how women's sports were framed within our data. So it's a good thing that that sort of sexualization, that the focus on women's personal life as opposed to their professional life is no longer prominent in the coverage. But what we're seeing now, again, is this overt. So we're not sexualizing female athletes, but we're not at the point where we're ready to sort of break out the champagne and celebrate that we've made it, and the battle of the sexes is over, for those of us who remember that reference, right? That there is still this way in which sexism operates, but for someone who's not really attuned to seeing it or thinking about this in this framework, it might just sort of run past you. And so you watch the segments on women's sports and think, wow, this is kind of, women's sports just aren't as exciting as men's, without really sort of deeply processing why that is and how and what ways does the media coverage and the lack of excitement, the lack of audience building help to contribute to that idea that women's sports are less exciting. So one of the things that we are talking about in this paper and some of the other projects that we're working on is the unevenness of social change. And that unevenness of social change is very prevalent in the mass media, as we showed in the data that I talked with you today. So in 1989, there was nearly no coverage of live broadcast women's basketball, for example. It was very rare to get it. At some point, we got some coverage, but it was tape delay, and it was on very, channels that you might not necessarily have, at times that you might not necessarily be watching. Now in 2014, and this has been the case I think since 2003, the entire tournament is broadcast. This is huge, but we still see some difference in terms of production values falling short in comparison to men's. We see the declining coverage of women's sports and news and highlight shows on the one hand, as I talked about, but then also that's coupled with the relative absence of sexualization and trivialization. So there's this kind of ways in which we're making progress, or things might be improving if your indicator by which you're measuring this is equality, then other ways where there might be some more work that needs to be done. And I'm going to end here with a few kind of quick notes for us to think about. Those of you that followed the 2016 Olympics, yeah, did you catch this? The kind of discussion? Yeah, what was going on in the 2016 Olympics? Are you familiar with? You were like, yeah, tell me. Yeah.
Well, it's a lot like what you were saying previously, and indicating that maybe it's gone down. This idea that women athletes are identified with as spouses or with other features of their lives, and this amazing win was credited to her husband's coach.
Yeah, and so I think this also speaks to the kind of unevenness of change. And even within I'll say this was the results that I share with you in those shifts, that's indicative for our data, our sample set. Whether or not those trends resonate in other media platforms, I think that's for researchers to look into, and they should, use that concept of gender-blind sexism and cite that work so Michaela Musto can be the deserving star that she is. But yeah, so this was you're talking about the guy in the that guy, or the Twitter. Tell me, which one were you first? Yeah. So I'm not connected. Okay, I was waiting for me to get choked. This particular image, this is a kind of a snapshot from Twitter, and this was posted by the Chicago Tribune, and it reads, "Wife of a Bears lineman wins a bronze medal today in Rio Olympics." Yes, so she does have a name, and this actually created a huge firestorm on Twitter. A lot of people were kind of callback culture that my students talk about that I really don't quite understand, but I guess it's like sort of resisting those trends, and they were like, she has a name. What sport did she win the medal in? Now, the Chicago Tribune later apologized and said, like, we were just trying to make that kind of local connection so people would know. My question then is, why do you have to make a local connection by mentioning, well, we wouldn't know who she was otherwise, because women's sports and women's trap shooting in particular doesn't get coverage even during the Olympic years. This is an image of Katina Hosszús, who is a Hungarian swimmer, broke the world record. He created a lot of media attention in the NBC's televised broadcast of the games. And for those of you that were watching the swimming events, I think I might have some swimmers here. Do I have swimmers? People from yay, swimming, okay. But so if you watch the event, like, it was hard not to notice him. The camera was always panning to him in the crowd, and he of course was very yeah, and he's also her husband and coach. So I mean, it kind of made sense, but the focus became more on him than her and her accomplishments. Katie Ledecky, some sports writers have referred to her as the world's best athlete. However, within the NBC broadcast and in Sports Illustrated, she was referred to as the next Michael Phelps, the female Michael Phelps, yes. And Ryan Lochte, in an interview in Sports Illustrated, attributed her swimming prowess and her athletic prowess to the fact that she, quote, swims like a man. And then this was, I apologize, at the snapshot, this is a clip from the Business Insider, who had interviewed NBC's Chief Marketing Officer, John Miller, and I'm going to get back to the podium here so I can read this for you, who said, oh, I can't even read that on that. I'm going to get here. I forgot my notes, I apologize. The people who watch the Olympics are not particularly sports fans. More women watch the games than men, and find the that of broadcasting certain events at certain times?
Well, I was the press rep for the shooting team at the Olympics.
Oh,
I actually represented Corey Cosdell.
okay. Yeah, so she does have a name?
She does, Corey Cosdell and Ryan, yes.
Yeah.
And I was with her when that called me to set up that interview. So it was really interesting to see, as with all of our medalists for shooting, we're all women. And so we did the circuit of the mother, wife, yada, yada, yada. But it was, the second that came out, it actually turned to her as an athlete and her game, which was really interesting to see that brought that about. But she embraced it. It was one of those where she saw the tweet come through and she's like, oh, come on. But like, her husband is super supportive.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone saw the follow-up. The Chicago Bears all wore T-shirts congratulating her, and they did some social media push too. So it was really to be covered as an elite athlete.
Yes, yes. And I think a lot, I mean, I would argue that a lot of that was possible, or I should say, let me backtrack. I'm going to step out on a ledge here. I don't think that would have been possible in a day prior to social media. I don't think that would have happened, right? I think social media and that the outcry and the resistance, which now, you know, the traditional mainstream media are using social media as a source for information and a source for quotes. So the mainstream media is also kind of picking up on this. And in fact, what was surprising to me, not so much that there were these instances of sexism in the Olympics, and there were probably others that I didn't mention here today, but what was surprising to me was the fact that sexism in the coverage of the Olympic Games became a mainstream media news frame for talking about the Olympics. And I was like, I was interviewed by a journalist who was like, so what do you make of all this and what do you think of this? And I was like, finally, after 30 plus years of research, we're finally getting people to understand what's happening and how egregious this is. And so this is just a snapshot of some of the headlines that were in the news. What was also fascinating to me was the fact that this wasn't just in feminist media outlets. This wasn't just in politically progressive media outlets. This was in mainstream media outlets like the Los Angeles Times. This was in outlets outside of the United States context, Cosmopolitan, which is, you know, ostensibly feminist, right? I don't know. Time Magazine, the Bleacher Report, so sports bloggers were picking up on this. And Bleacher Report isn't really known for its, you know, kind of embracement of feminist principles, although I'm sure there might be some feminists writing on the Bleacher Reports, but just overall, they're not known for that type of coverage. And of course, Mother Jones, which is a progressive outlet, which had my favorite article title, and I have to read this. The Olympics are chock full of sexist bullshit, and it's only the first week. So, some challenges and considerations, and then these are some things that I want us to think about, and we can talk more in the Q&A. So the increased interest in women's sports and increased broadcast coverage of men's sports has not migrated to televised news and highlight shows. So we know women's broadcast events are being broadcast. Women's sports are being broadcast on live television. They're being covered in a number of different media outlets. But we don't see that in terms of the televised news and highlight shows, at least within our sample and with some of the other research that's out there. Men's sports has played a key role in reaffirming beliefs of natural, quote unquote, male superiority during times when girls and women are achieving equality in a number of social institutions. And so sport becomes the space where men can kind of, at least what feminist scholars argue, sort of preserve that sense of power, entitlement, dominance in a time where gender roles may be shifting or under duress, so to speak. The lack of coverage and dull and lackluster coverage of women's sports silences, we argue, women's historical movement into sports and retains sport as an important site for when beliefs about male superiority are reproduced. So in other words, by not covering women's sports, it sends viewers the message that sports are still about men, and that men's sports matters more so than women's. And this is I'm sorry, this is an older version of this slide. So I stopped. Well, this sentence ends in the middle of it. I saved an older version of this on my flash drive. So maybe I'll try to piece this together. So what role, I guess, we can think about social media have for amplifying voices of resistance, and to pressure sport media to cover athletes in ways that actually highlight, I'm hoping this was the rest of my sentence, that actually highlight women's physicality, women's athleticism, their prowess. And the issue here for me isn't so much that athletes are covered, or athletes get asked questions about being a mother, or athletes want to appear in Playboy or FHM or some other magazine. Sports Illustrated, Serena Williams cover, I think, was a really interesting one. If you haven't seen it, I could probably pull it up. The issue isn't that those images exist. The issue is that the coverage is so low to begin with. The opportunities for us, and those of us who are consuming sports media, to learn about women's sports, to see the incredible athleticism and abilities and capabilities of these women, and to celebrate in that, and to consume those kinds of images, it's so low and so rare that if this is the only way, or if this is the primary way, thank you, altitude, of thinking about women's athletes, what messages does that send to viewers? And this isn't just about girls and what kinds of role models they might have. This is about boys, and this is about men and women. And we think about gender in society and how those images may actually reaffirm some very kind of antiquated ideas about women and their capabilities and capacities. As I mentioned, this is public advocacy, social science research, so you can actually get this, unlike other journal articles, online. It's open access, and we specifically worked with the journal editor, Lawrence Wenner, at Communication and Sport, to make this available to the public, so you can actually download this article, and I encourage you to do so because it's super awesome. And also email me, because that gender bland sexism article hasn't come out yet, but when it does, you can be the first to have it in your mailbox. Super exciting. And I want to just thank all the different individuals and institutions that were key to this particular presentation. The University of Michigan's Sport Health Activity Research and Policy Center, which financially supported this project, as well as the University of Southern California Center for Feminist Research, the University of Southern California Annenberg School for Communication, which was instrumental in recording all the data for us, Purdue University's Office of the Provost, Margaret Carlisle and Duncan and Wayne Wilson, who were very instrumental in terms of the earlier iterations of this report in a research capacity, Emily Fogel and Randy Cass, the undergraduate students at Purdue, who were instrumental in the tedious coding of the data, Horacio Becerra, my better half, who was our data analyst guru, Mark Schneider and Don Sabo at the Women's Sport Foundation, and as I mentioned, Lawrence Wenner in the editorial board at Communication and Sport. Thank you. So I believe we have time for some Q&A. I'm gonna get Jessica. Yes.